book of Genesis, chapter 21, verses 8 through 21, and I'll do my best to get it right. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that the offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took the bread and the skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat opposite and a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite of him, she lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Blessed is the hearing and the reading of God's word.
Thank you, Dave. The morning air was cool, and the ground was still a little damp from the overnight dew. The smell of pine was thick in the air, and the sun was just starting to trickle through the trees. As we walked a few hundred yards from our campsite, all we heard was the crunching of fallen pine needles and twigs under our feet. Everything else was silent. This doesn't sound like a desert, I know. Our Holy Road Trip sermon series has already taken us to the mountains and to the seas, and we will venture into the sandy desert soon enough today, I promise. But remember, we all visit the spiritual wilderness in different ways and in different places. It's the desert for some people, and northern Minnesota for others. Before we started that morning hike, my friends, Aaron and Nate and I, never planned out that we would be silent on that walk. It just kind of happened that way. No one was allowed to wander into the woods alone, so we followed the rule of 3 as we ventured beyond our campsite. We came to a clearing and found some fallen logs to sit and have a rest. And we stayed there for a little while, maybe a long while. Time seemed to escape us. Still silent. We had left our silly jokes and antics behind, which is wildly uncharacteristic as I think about this in hindsight. We were the 3 chattiest kids in this youth group. We were always singing made-up lyrics to popular tunes, badly, I might add, creating our own ridiculous soundtrack for the trip, laughing obnoxiously. And yet, we managed to sit in an all-embracing peace for a good long time that morning. I studied all the things around us for a little while, letting my eyes wander to the ground and to the trees and to the sunlight. And eventually, I just looked straight ahead, noticing my friends sitting with me. I suddenly just really noticed them in that moment. We were together in this expansive place, this forest, and although at 17 years old, I would probably not have put it this way, we were in the presence of God. Of that, I am now sure. and it brought me peace. I don't know how else to describe it, but something told me to hold on to that moment. I don't think I would have heard it, whatever it was telling me to hold on to this moment, if I had been talking or laughing or singing badly. Deep down, I had a sense that we would need to recapture the feeling of calm and comfort again one day. I just didn't know why or when. Many years ago, in one of my very first sermons as a student pastor here in this church, I shared a story about this very trip to the Boundary Waters that I had taken with my church youth group all those years ago. But it's been at least a decade or two since I did any reflecting on this particular experience of that trip. And then I reread this story about Hagar and Ishmael, and it brought me right back to that place. Their scene was very different from that of northern Minnesota. In the area we now refer to as part of the Holy Land, Hagar and Ishmael found themselves in a place not exactly lush with trees. Beersheba is part of a sprawling desert. We believe that after Abraham sent them out, the mother and son had been walking for about 80 miles before they finally collapsed into the spot we read about today. Beersheba is a place revisited later in Genesis several times. In one of the most troubling stories of the Bible, it's where Abraham starts a journey with Isaac, eventually leading him to a mountain where Abraham nearly sacrifices his own son as a burnt offering. Do you remember that one? And years later, Beersheba is also where Isaac's son Jacob steals the birthright from his brother Esau. Some dark things happened in that desert. But as Hagar experienced, some hope was delivered there too. She didn't go into the wilderness of her own choice. She was sent there by Abraham and Sarah. Described as a slave woman, Hagar was Egyptian and had been forced to help the couple by having a child for them when Sarah herself was unable to. And now, some 14 or 16 years later, she and her son have been cast out, led to wander a desolate place with no support and no resources and no future. Hagar's story is complicated. Phyllis Tribble writes about it beautifully. Dr. Tribble is known as a pioneer in women's biblical studies, and in her book, Texts of Terror, she writes this: as a symbol of the oppressed, Hagar becomes many things to many people. Most importantly, all sorts of rejected women find their stories in her. She is the faithful maid exploited, the black woman used by the male and abused by the female of the ruling class, the surrogate mother, the resident alien without legal recourse, the other woman, the runaway youth, and so on. Let me go on record as saying I do not see myself as Hagar. But Hagar's situation feels hopeless. This is why so many rejected women relate to her. She has a son whose father has just dismissed both of them. Convinced that Ishmael will perish in the desert, she turns away because she cannot bear to watch her son die. She must feel as if she has no power at all, weakened by what others had done to her. But if we back up for just a little bit and look at Hagar in the fuller picture, more glorious context of her story, we come to see her as very powerful indeed. In an earlier trip to the desert, also documented in Genesis, Hagar is the first person in the Bible to be visited by a messenger of God. She is the first person recorded as having given God a name, Elroy, meaning God and King. And as Phyllis Tribble writes, within the historical memories of Israel, she is the first woman to bear a child. For each of these remarkable firsts, we turn to Hagar. She holds more power and strength than others have even recognized. They've sent her to the desert to be rid of her and rid of the competition that her son Ishmael might bring to Isaac. But there is nothing that others can do, including even the great Abraham, to move Hagar out of God's sights and away from God's voice. In the desert, Hagar cries out in desperation, and the text tells us that Ishmael, at a distance from his mother, must have also cried out because he is heard by God. And then we read, God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid." In that wide open wilderness, God speaks to Hagar, who is the faithful maid exploited, the abused woman, the surrogate mother, the resident alien, the runaway youth. To speak to her means God must be with her. And then God opens her eyes. In a world far away and thousands of years later, Pastor Jessica was actually excited to enter a spiritual wilderness of her own. She chose to go on a spiritual retreat because she needed a reset of sorts. In professional ministry in various capacities for about 20 years. Jessica had recently graduated from seminary, where she'd been a full-time student while also working full-time. She had taken on a demanding new pastoral role in not one, but 2 churches simultaneously, and she was busy raising 5 children with her husband. Amidst all of these things, she was and is a fiercely loyal and dear, dear friend. I've known Jessica for a long time. She's given me permission to share this story. I also know her well enough to editorialize a little bit. Her life was chaotic. Like so many of us, she questioned if she was strong enough to do it all. A silent retreat center was just the oasis she was looking for. Yes, you heard me correctly. I thought she was crazy. A preacher on a silent retreat. It sounds like an oxymoron. But Jessica assured me that the time was very valuable. And this is what she had to say. When you are in time set apart for prayer and listening, you slow down. It takes you out of the natural rhythm of society's pace of go and do. Instead, you sit and listen. Jessica was making space for time and discernment, and for almost a week she journaled and she prayed and she wandered and she ate, chewing her food exactly 28 times. She told me that was a rule. But most importantly, she sat quietly and she listened. Having spoken to Jessica before and after her retreat, I observed a change in her. She seemed calmer and more confident afterwards. She started prioritizing her needs. Before she was ever a mom, or a seminary student, or a pastor, or a friend, she was Jessica. She was all the things God had called her to be, and on this retreat, reclaimed the most important part of her identity. Jessica admits this retreat was her desert experience, and at the end of it, God opened her eyes so she could see her own strength. Some people are thrust into the desert by their situations and by their stations in life, like Hagar. There is no way to defend people or systems and cultural practices that exclude or exile others. There is no justification for the ways in which people attempt to take power from others or exploit them. Humans have a long history of forcing each other into seemingly unprotected wilderness places. The good news for Hagar is that when everyone else has abandoned her, God does not. Some of us choose to venture into the wilderness on our own because we feel overwhelmed and lost, and it's where we hope to be found, like Jessica, and like my high school friends and I did in the Boundary Waters. 3 months after we visited the Boundary Waters, our youth group lost one of our dear friends and members. Jeff Rogers, the son of our pastor, died suddenly. Jeff was a grounding force in our youth group. He had been with us on that very trip. He was funny, and he was reliable, and he laughed at our stupid made-up lyrics, and he was truly a joy to be with, and he had been one of our very dear friends. He had an undiagnosed health condition that took him from this world at only 15 years old. Nothing about it was fair. It was the first death of someone who I knew and loved, and I felt so lost and powerless and weak. Our church youth group came together as soon as we had all heard the news. I sat there with my head down and my eyes shut, and I didn't know if I had shut them out of anger or out of sadness or just in prayer. I just knew that I couldn't bear to look up. Then my friend Aaron brought up the memory from that morning in the woods, that clearing among the trees where I had felt such peace among those people. It turned out they had felt it too. And with that story, as soon as she mentioned it, I looked up and I saw my little community all gathered together. And we talked about just wanting to go back. And we talked about Jeff, and we sang our stupid songs. There was a reason I felt called to hold on to that feeling months earlier. It was for this moment. So in my heart, I allowed myself to go there, to recall a peace that passes understanding, the feeling of being in the presence of God. I felt less lost. And like just maybe, with the help of these friends and this little community who I had sat across in the wilderness, I was strong enough to move through grief with them. You don't have to walk to the desert or journey to the boundary waters or make a reservation at a silent retreat center to enter a spiritual wilderness. It's the place where we allow our hearts to enter when we are listening for God's voice and looking for God's company. Let us learn from Hagar. Her story is one of hope. There is no place where we can go where God won't see us. There is no situation so desperate that God abandons us. No matter what has made you feel weak, grief or worry or overwhelm, no matter what other people have attempted to do to diminish your power, you are invited to sit still and listen. Let God tell you how strong you are, and let God open your eyes.